Hi, boys and girls, ready for part 24? Okay, last we left off, I think that Lewis had divided his little pack and taken a little journey into the wilderness. And so let's see what happens next. In the days that followed, the men loaded the horses with baggage. They brought back the supplies from the caches and retrieved the canoes. They tied ropes to the canoes so that the horses could pull them on makeshift wagons. Seaman and one of the men stood guard over the baggage as the others rode, leading the pack horses around the waterfalls. This time the portage went quickly, since the men weren't carrying their supplies on foot over the prickly pears. After the portage, they made camp downstream from Great Falls and got the canoes ready to continue traveling. After the hard work was finished, Seaman padded about the camp. He leaped to his feet when he heard the sound of hoofbeats, but the sounds were made by the horses left in camp, not by Lewis returning. The men repacked the supplies they hunted. They worried about their captain's safety. After all, Lewis had gone deep into the Blackfoot country. With only 3 men, the Blackfoot Indians were feared by all Indians who hunted on the plains. The Shoshones, the Hadassahs, the Mandans. Perhaps Captain Lewis was in danger. But the men didn't know where he was, so how could they go to his rescue? Seaman stayed close to John Coulter while Lewis was away. When Coulter went hunting, Seaman ran beside him. Around the campfire in the evening, Coulter stroked Seaman's fur, and at night the dog snuggled close to Coulter's bedroll. Although Seaman rested his head on his paw and shut his eyes, he was always listening for the sound of his hoofbeats. Day after day, Seaman listened. Day after day, there was no sign of Captain Lewis. Finally, on July 28th, nearly 2 weeks after Lewis had ridden away with his scouting party, Seaman heard the pounding of horses' hooves running hard across the plains. He began to bark and dashed up the riverbank into the tall grass. Lewis and his scouts were coming. They were riding swiftly, shouting and waving their hats at the men in camp. Captain Lewis jumped off his horse and breathlessly greeted Seaman and the men. He knelt to stroke Seaman as he told their story. We met a party of Blackfoot braves, and they camped with us. When they thought we were asleep, they tried to steal our weapons. They were going to disarm us, then kill us, those scoundrels. As soon as we began to fight them off, they tried to drive away our horses so we'd be stranded. Lewis and his 3 companions were breathing hard. They kept glancing nervously back across the plains for any sign of horseback riders. What happened? John Coulter asked. Did you kill the Blackfeet? We killed 2 of them in a scuffle, so we must hurry, Lewis said. The other Blackfoot braves have probably gathered a large war party by now. The men quickly loaded their gear aboard their canoes and pushed off. They paddled hard, trying to put miles of river between their small group and the enraged Blackfeet. 2 of the men rode beside the river, herding the group's horses. Aboard one of the canoes, Coulter looked closely at Lewis. You look worn out, Captain, he said. We rode for a day and a night, only stopping briefly to rest the horses. Then we rode hard the next day, Lewis explained. He rubbed his neck. I'm not just worn out. I've never been so sore in my life. That night, the explorers made a camp on the far side of the river just to be sure that the Blackfeet could not ambush them in the dark. After posting heavy guard, Lewis crawled on top of his bedroll. It began to rain, but there was no shelter near the camp. Seaman settled down next to Lewis, and Lewis threw one arm over the dog's warm body. Then he fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When he awoke in the morning, he and Seaman were both drenched. Paddling hard, they headed away from Blackfoot territory. The sooner they reached the spot where the Yellowstone River flowed into the Missouri River, the sooner they would have all 33 men and members of the Corps as their fighting force. They reached that spot on August 7th, but Clark's group wasn't there. The explorers pulled the canoes onto the banks and searched for signs of the rest of the Corps. They found the ashes of a campfire and footprints. Seaman padded about, sniffing. When he found a pole stuck in the ground, he barked. A note was struck on the pole. Coulter grabbed the note and handed it to Lewis. It was from Captain Clark, Lewis announced. He says they've moved their camp downstream because mosquitoes were more plentiful than game at this spot. So we proceeded on. All right, let's pull the paddles, called Coulter as he splashed into the water. Lewis' group kept traveling. Although they found several more notes at abandoned campsite, they couldn't tell how far ahead Clark had led his party. On August 11th, Lewis spotted elk on an island. Since his group was running low on game, he ordered the boat to pull up. Lewis took Seaman and Cruzette to do some hunting. The two men shot one elk and wounded another. Plunging into the trees after the wounded elk, Lewis spotted the animal, stood up to aim, and was knocked off his feet by a blast. "I've been shot!" he screamed in pain, stabbing through his left thigh. He reached around and felt the seat of his buckskin trousers. The back of his pants were ripped, and when he looked at his hands, he realized he was bleeding heavily. "Cruzette, where are you? Did you mistake me for an elk man?" Cruzette didn't answer, but Seaman came crashing through the underbush and sniffed Lewis's wound. Lewis ripped a strip of leather off his shirt and tied it around the seat of his pants to slow the bleeding. "Come on, boy," he gasped. Using his rifle for support, he looked back towards the boat. As he emerged from the brush, he shouted to them, "Grab your guns. I've been shot. I think we've been ambushed, and I don't know if it's the Blackfeet. The Indians have Cruzette." The men grabbed their guns and ran into the trees. Lewis limped after them, but his wound had become so painful he could not continue. He slumped to the ground, and Seaman stood guard next to him. Lewis was confused. Why wasn't Seaman chasing after the Indians who had attacked him? For that matter, why hadn't Seaman warned him that the strangers were nearby? Soon the men came running back to the riverbank. Cruzette was with them, and he was unharmed. Nobody had seen any Indians. No footprints, no sound. With the men's help, Lewis ripped off the bloody trousers and bathed his wound. Luckily, the shot had not hit a bone or an artery. It was a flesh wound. The rifle ball had passed through the skin on Lewis's left thigh and lodged on his buckskin trousers. The men argued about how Lewis was shot. "I didn't see any sign of Indians or any other people," Coulter said. "If somebody else was in the woods, we would have seen them, or seen their footprints, or heard snapping twigs." Anyway, Seaman would have warned the captain of an ambush. Cruzette kept denying he had fired the ball that hit Lewis, but everybody knew how easy it would have been to mistake a man in leather clothing for an elk, especially with trees and brush to block the view. Since they had no other clues, the men suspected that Cruzette had accidentally shot his own captain. Meanwhile, Lewis doctored himself up to help the men. They carried him to one of the canoes and laid him face down so there was no weight on his wound. Seaman crawled up beside Lewis, and the wounded captain held onto his dog so he wouldn't roll as the boat moved. The men paddled hard downstream, hoping to catch up with Captain Clark's group. That evening, Lewis was in so much pain the men were afraid to move him, so he spent the night lying in the boat. The men soaked clothes in medicine and placed them on the wound. Lewis developed a fever during the night and tossed and turned as he dozed. To bring down his fever, the men bathed his forehead with cool water. Seaman stayed beside Lewis all night. Each time the patient awkward from his restless sleep, Seaman gently licked his face. From his restless sleep, Seaman gently licked his face. The next morning, the group started early. As they paddled down the Missouri River, they met two white men paddling upriver. These were the first white men the explorers had seen since they left Fort Mandan a year and a half before. Seaman stood in the canoe and watched the strangers pull their boat alongside the explorers' canoe. The men introduced themselves as Joseph Dixon and Forrest Hancock, trappers on their way to the mouth of the Yellowstone River to hunt beaver. The explorers introduced themselves as the men sent by President Jefferson to explore the West. They explained they were in a hurry to rejoin the rest of their group because their captain had been wounded. "You're going to be all right. Do you need any help?" the trappers asked Lewis. "I think it's just a flesh wound," Lewis said. The trappers asked about the country upriver, and Lewis offered to give them a copy of the list of distances that he had used. "That would be real helpful," Dixon said. John Coulter fished the list out of Lewis's pack and handed them to the trapper. As Hancock took the papers, he looked into Coulter's eyes and said, "We'd like to take another man with us." The trappers searched the faces of the other men. "How about it? Any of you want to go back up the river?" Lewis explained that all the men were enlisted in the Corps of Discovery. Dixon and Hancock thanked Lewis for his list as the explorers started to paddle away. Dixon called to them, "My partner and I have changed our minds. Mind if we stay with your group for a while? Who knows, maybe one of your men will decide to come with us. We sure could use an extra man as we head west." Lewis told the trappers they were welcome to come along. Later that day, the boats rounded a bend and Seaman stood up, barking happily. The men soon spotted the reason for Seaman's excitement. Captain Clark and the others were in the camp along the river. "Captain Lewis is wounded. He was shot," called the men aboard the canoes. Clark came running down to the boat. The color drained from his face when he saw his partner lying on the bottom of the boat. "What happened, Meriwether?" he said, shocked. The other men told the story as they carried Lewis into camp. Sacagawea and York heated water to wash the wound and tore cloth and fresh bandages. Clark carefully examined the injury. Then he gently cleaned the area and bandaged it loosely. "How does it look, William?" Lewis asked. "Has my wound gotten infected?" "I think it's pretty clean," Clark said. "The skin should heal in a few weeks. The ball ripped out a hunk of your flesh, but it didn't do any serious damage." "That's a relief," Lewis said. "When the pain became so bad I couldn't walk, I was afraid the injury was worse." "This is quite a piece of bad luck, though," Clark said, frowning. "We've come all the way back from the Pacific coast. We're practically to the Mandan villages, and now you've been shot. And by one of our own men, it seems." Clark shook his head. "Well, thank God it's not too serious." Lewis looked at Clark and grinned. "I guess you won't be able to complain about me sitting around too much." Clark broke into a laugh. "No, Meriwether, I dare say you won't be sitting at all for quite some time." When Clark finished doctoring Lewis, Sacagawea knelt by the patient's side and gently fed him some broth. The captains recounted the events that happened on their separate routes. Clark was shocked to hear about Lewis's fight with the Blackfeet. "It's a miracle you weren't wounded or killed in that encounter, Meriwether." While the captains were talking, Seaman made a quick run through camp to greet the men. When he spotted George Shannon, he ran to the young men. Shannon knelt and scratched Seaman's back and thighs. The dog twisted his head around his mouth open in what looked like a grin. After a few minutes, Seaman wiggled free and trotted back to Lewis's side. As soon as Seaman returned to the group gathered around Lewis, York tossed a stick for him to retrieve, but Seaman merely wagged his tail. "Okay, Seaman, I get it," York said. "No playing games while you've got a patient to look after. Is that it, boy?" Seaman whelped and nuzzled York's hand. Later on, Sacagawea took Pomp out of his cradle board to feed him. Seaman edged close to the baby and nuzzled a soft greeting. Pomp buried his hands in the dog's fur and said, "Seema." Sacagawea paused, surprised. She waited to see if Pomp would repeat the sound. Lewis hoisted himself on his elbow and asked, "Janie, did I just hear Pomp say Seaman's name?" Sacagawea shrugged. "I don't know," she said. Seaman gently nudged little Pomp. He bathed the baby's face with his sticky tongue. The spit bath made Pomp giggle. He repeated, "Seema! Seema!" in a loud voice. Sacagawea looked at Lewis. "Yes, I think he did say Seaman's name." She smiled proudly. We'll stop there for today. We're so close. Thanks for listening, you guys.